Call to order the special meeting for the Anchorage Assembly for November 19th, 2013. Madam Clerk, would you please do the roll call?
Mr. Trainee.
Here, ma'am.
Mr. Honeman.
Here, by phone.
Ms. Gray-Jackson.
Why don't you be here?
Mr. Hall.
Here.
Ms. Johnston. Mr. Starr.
Here.
Mr. Trombley.
Here.
Mr. Flynn. Mr. Birch.
Here.
Mr. Steele.
Here.
Ms. Demboski.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Ms. Gray-Jackson, would you please lead us in the pledge? I have one laid on the table item that we need to incorporate into the agenda. If I could have a motion to do that, I would read it.
Move to incorporate.
Okay. This item relates to 14F and 4F and 4G on the special meeting agenda, as well as 11G on the regular meeting agenda. And this is AIM 134, and it's from myself, and the subject is Planning and Zoning Commission resolution. Any objection to that being incorporated? Seeing, hearing none, that item will be incorporated. Mr. Trombley, you have a motion.
I'd like to move to reorder the agenda and take up item 14A after 14G, or I'm sorry, 4A after 4G. And the reasoning is because if we modify the fees and fines, it'll change our budget, so we have to take up the budget before we modify the fees and fines.
Second.
Any objection? Mr. Honeman?
No objection.
Okay, thank you. We will reorder the agenda. So we now have before us item 4B. It is AO number 101, an ordinance of the Municipality of Anchorage adopting and appropriating funds for the 2014 General Government Operating Budget for the Municipality of Anchorage. This item is before us.
We want to move the S version, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second to move the S version. Any objection? Hearing none, we have the S version moved, and the chair is now, I'm going to go through the amendments in the order that they are before me, and I'm starting with amendment number 1, and that was submitted by L.V. Gray-Jackson, Tim Steele, Dick Trainee. Would one of you like to move your amendment and speak to it?
Move amendment number 1.
Mr. Trainee?
What this is designed to do is, as you know, we are taking care of the transportation inspectors. The problem is right now they only have one part-time inspector. And with the taxi ordinance, one does pass, we'll have additional money coming in. We need to have 2 full-time inspectors to make sure that all the taxis are inspected the way they should be and the public is safe when they take a ride in them. So that's the reason for bringing this forward. It has administration support, I'm told, from Eric Musser, and I think Mr. Vacalis supports it. It's just we're bringing this forward.
Okay, Mr. Trainee, would you specify the revenue source?
Revenue source is the fees coming in.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Flynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't necessarily disagree with the amendment. However, I would like to hold off on approving it until we actually approve the taxi ordinance so that we know the fees will be there. And because it doesn't affect the tax cap one way or the other, we could do it subsequent to passage of the final ordinance, presuming we actually do pass it. That's my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, let's ask the administration if that will work for them. I have no problem when we do it. I just want to make sure we get these positions filled. I understand what you're saying, Pat.
That works.
That'll work for you guys?
Okay, I've cleared my screen. That being so, I would need a motion basically dealing with that, to postpone.
Go ahead and motion to postpone this item until after we pass the taxi ordinance. December 3rd is when we're supposed to pass it.
We can just let it die.
Just let it die? Okay.
Okay.
Let it die with no vote?
Right.
Very good. Amendment number 2, that is submitted by L.V. Gray Jackson and Tim Steele and Dick Trainee.
Move to approve.
Second.
I'll speak real briefly to this. I know for years the Federation used to receive $108,000 from the Assembly to do their business on behalf of the folks in this community, and now they're down to $80,000. And I know that Mr. Trainee was spent a lot of time working on the Community Council ordinance, and he can speak to that. But this is just basically increasing their funding from $80,000 to $5,000. I mean, by an additional $5,000 from $80,000 to $85,000 to help them do their job more thoroughly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Starr.
Mr. Trainee, do they know that you're asking for this, or how did the amount originate?
They know I told them I was going to ask an additional increase, just a small little increase.
Well, the
Because-
emphasis, when you mentioned at the work session, was for postal and the increased rates for distribution
They've been
by
actually
mail.
reducing the amount, Bill, that they put into postal, but still the cost and everything has gone up. We've reduced them down from 130,000 down to 80,000 now, and if we keep reducing them, they're going to wake out of existence.
The inference that they needed the money was communicated because the increasing postage costs. That's
Yeah.
what the premise is,
That's the premise of it.
even though,
Plus, we're giving them more responsibilities with the new ordinance we have coming forward on community councils. It's going to require them to do additional things. And $5,000, take a look at that versus the 130 we used to fund them at. The demand has increased, and we've been reducing their amount of money we give them. They work for us.
I'm
Work
not
for the
convinced.
public.
But
Let's just get this done.
I know you want to get it done. I do too. I'm not convinced, but thank you for the debate, Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Bill.
Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Trainee, in the new ordinance that you have, and we're not here to debate the ordinance, but one of the things that we've noticed is that the Federation hasn't been very prompt in submitting their budget on time. It's generally been incomplete. Do you think that this funding will help address issues like that? I don't want to provide additional funding if they're not doing their job currently.
Mr. Trombley, my commitment to you is I am now assigned by the chairman to attend the Federation meetings. I attend their meetings every month. And I'm the one that told them, September, where is your budget? And I will be there every meeting and make sure they deliver their budget on time to us.
Okay.
Because if nothing else, I'm loudmouthed and they'll hear me.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee.
Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the Federation, they asked for $25,000, so we're only giving them a fifth of what their initial request was, and I think it's definitely worthwhile, and I hope my colleagues support this increase. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Mr. Honeman.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the increased support. The reasoning for it is the mailing. Not only has the postage gone up somewhat, but there's not been a lot of mailing because there's not been enough money in the budget. A lot of community councils still have a lot of their constituents that get their information by mail. Much as they tried the electronic and they've got web pages and they've got email connections, sometimes you just have to mail at least once, if not twice a year. And that's been falling off over the years. Really it's showing up in the community council. So I encourage support.
Thank you, Mr. Honeman. Ms. Dembowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair, Mr. Trainee, one of the comments that I've heard in our community councils from at least 3 of them is they would like to help with their post office box fees, which seems nominal. Would that, in your mind, would that qualify for provide outreach efforts to the community?
Yes.
Thank you.
Seeing no one else in the queue, please vote. Mr. Honeman.
Yes.
Thank you.
That motion passes 10-1. We have before us amendment number 3, proposed by Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask all of the members when they're making their motions to please do it audibly, as well as please push your buttons so that your records are accurate. Thank you.
Move to approve.
Second.
This is a reduction in the proposed property tax increase of $2 million. One of the main reasons for that is we get our budget, or not our budget books, but our assembly packets from time to time. We always see that there's generally an over collection in the amount of property taxes from what we budgeted for to what we've actually got. And while this amount isn't the exact, we do see a continued amount of overcollection in property taxes, and I feel as though an overcollection is exactly that. We have more than we should, and we should give it back to the taxpayers.
Ms. Johnston.
Question for the administration. We just received our AAA rating. Is this something that our bond raters would be looking at as far as suggesting that we're dipping into fund balance before understanding what our fund balance is?
Through the chair, yes, that is correct. Every time I have interviews with our rating agents, they ask me, are you spending money that is anticipated or known? And we received an upgrade because we have really solid fiscal policies currently in place, and this would not represent a good fiscal policy.
Another question for the administration. If we had very healthy fund balances, or if our directors did as well as they've done the last couple of years, and actually we've had some budget surpluses, would this be something we could do in first quarter budget revision as we're setting our taxes?
Absolutely, and that is what we would encourage.
Thank you.
Mr. Steele?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that we would not pass this at this time. We can postpone it if the body wants to, but we do have amendments in here that are requiring an elimination of some funds, some funding that may be coming in, and I'm hoping that that we have the funding to do that. And so I think we're getting the cart before the horse based upon the number of amendments we have here.
Okay. Mr. Starr?
Well, back to the concept through the chair. Ms. Mahoney, the idea that first quarter budget, we're pretty finite in the amount of money we mill rate for, right down to the penny. Mr. Trombley's point is this, and I guess I didn't put you on the spot with a question earlier. Mr. Trombley's point is this, is that in April we say collect, $243 million right down to the penny. And when we have those monies come in, did we over-collect this year? Not intentionally, but did we collect more money than the appropriation that we intended for in April?
In regard to 2013 revenues, we are currently projecting in total to be over budget by $1 million. Okay, but when we're looking at fund balance, it's really important to consider the other side of the equation as well, which is expenditures. And right now, when I look at where we are tracking with expenditures, we're tracking right on budget. So if we're right on budget with expenditures and only $1 million over in revenues, one could construe, assuming there are no huge snowstorms or emergencies or some unexpected expenditures in the fourth quarter, that we might have $1 million excess. But I could not predict that at this point.
Well, I like that logic, and we can't predict, but the administration has suggested to take a $482,000 correction against the fact that it hasn't snowed up until date. So, in fact, that you're looking at sort of the anticipation that it's not going to have a heavy snow year between now and December. How is that different than the fact that we already know we've over-collected taxes? And Mr. Trombley's point is such that we only authorized the collection of, what the number was, $243,000, or $237, I should say, and change. Why is the logic okay to anticipate that it won't snow anymore, but the fact that Mr. Trombley's, I'm having trouble reconciling it. One seems to be a known number. We've already collected more than our budget required in property taxes. He wants to give it back.
No, it's an estimate. Okay, at this point, nothing is known, and it will not be known until we close the books, and they are audited in March of 2014. To spend money that we don't know that we even have at this point is not fiscally sound.
Well, I guess the concept, all the tax collections are in, and you just indicated that we over-collected by about $1 million. So the point is that it...
No, that's not correct.
What
all
did
the
you
tax
say?
dollars are not in. I said that in total, the total revenues, the 600 and some million, we are anticipating at this point in time to be $1 million over budget. of the 600 and some million, a portion of that is property taxes, not all of it.
I understood it wrong, then. I thought you'd mentioned that we had collected over $1 million, which the
In
year
total.
before we did, but I think this year, I'm not sure what we're trending.
Yeah, I can affirmatively talk about what's happened historically, and that is what we use when we set our property taxes, is what's actually happened.
Sure, I don't need to go down that conversation. We've had that 20-year spreadsheet, but historically we do. And I don't think it's intentional. I wouldn't infer that you're overtaxing the populace. It's just the way it works out by the time you do your assessments and your new construction, basically the lag between April and now. So thank you for your debate.
Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Trombley, I want to thank you for bringing this proposed amendment forward, because it is the honorable thing to attempt to do, especially considering the fact that we've had a surplus for the last 4 years. But I don't think this is the appropriate way to do it, because we're dealing with the 2014 budget, and the taxes that are included in this budget are part of balancing the budget. And if we do this amendment, we'll probably have to cut some services, because we're talking about the 2014 budget. And a budget is simply an estimate of what we anticipate our spending and our revenue to be for the upcoming year. So I appreciate what you're bringing forward, but now is not the right time to do it, and we should talk some more about it probably early next year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Mahoney.
I think my comments have been addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Trombley.
Ms. Mahoney, how often do we utilize our budget surplus in the past? And I'd like to commend the administration for always coming in under budget, and we generally have that surplus. I don't like to use that term because this is government. But from my recollection, how often do we actually apply those surpluses to property tax reduction first quarter budget revisions? What I've noticed in the past is that sometimes we roll that forward to help buffer the shortfall in the upcoming year. So do I have your commitment right now that any surplus first quarter budget revisions, you're going to be okay with offsetting property taxes?
That's not my decision. That's your decision.
Mr. Mayor, would you support any surplus that we have first quarter budget to offset property taxes, or are we going to roll that forward like we've done in the past?
Well, we've done more than roll it forward, Mr. Trombley. As you remember, we've used the monies to get rid of one-time expenses, fund police academies, pay for environmental cleanups, pay back the ML&P loan of millions of dollars. So it's really just best to wait till first quarter and you see what's on the table. Are there one-time expenses the Assembly would like to clear off? Is there property tax relief we'd like to apply? I mean, that's how the process works best, is at first quarter we have all those numbers in front of us, the exact amount of money that may be unspent revenues. We have a pretty good idea of what liabilities might be facing us. As you know, we do have some legal issues coming before the body as well. So I can't make a commitment on what we would approve. We just have to wait till we get there.
Mr. Starr.
Well, I appreciate that. I have one more question for Ms. Mahoney, and then I'd like to have just the floor to debate the issue, and I'll be done. Ms. Mahoney, in a previous administration, I had kind of the unsettling task of having to make the accusation that we didn't provide accurate data to Standard & Poor's. And the reason I was concerned about that is because Standard & Poor's, when they do our rating, analyzes our financials from a lot of different aspects, as you do. And one of the things I believe they do is they go in and do a fund balance analysis of their own. And they sort of validate our math. And so when I made those statements back in the day, I was worried that we gave them old data. Did Standard & Poor's do a fund balance analysis of their own based on the data that you gave them?
Yes, Standard & Poor's does an analysis of our historical CAFR reports, and they evaluate that. They have a methodology that is different than the methodology that we use for our policy to determine fund balance.
So the cash in bank, or the balance to the emergency, and then the bond rating portion as we speak to it, they don't necessarily categorize it. They look at perhaps just available capital cash in terms of overall budgets and spending. Is that too much of a summary?
No, that's correct.
Do they use our utilities and our cash balances in our enterprise funds as part of that calculation as well?
They do not.
What did Standard & Poor's say in terms of response to their calculations on the fund balance?
Standard & Poor's said our fund balance was strong.
I get that. No, I don't know that, did they give you a percentage?
The percentages were, I think, 15 and 17% for the last 2 years. What they do is, you know, they look at the actual fund balance that hits the books at the end of the year.
So the 15% is you know, with our policy statement that's the sort of the gap that we're tracing when we're looking at that. If we've got an overfunding, they could see a 15% fund balance, and then we try to rebate money back to there to get it inside the 12 to 13%. Is that mechanically what we do?
Yeah, so for example, at the end of the year, let's assume it was 15%. That's what would fall to the bottom line in December, audited, and then to the extent that you all would decide you want to spend the delta, then you would appropriate that during first quarter budget, which has been done every single year since I've been here in 2009.
Yeah, and then some by some of us, so I think that's where Mr. Trombley's trying to go. Thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I indicated that I wanted to talk about some of the ramifications that I see in the message that we send to our population. And a businessman and a property owner, I think you have to be cautious that we can wait till first quarter budget amendments to sort of gel the number. I think that's important. But the message that we send in the fact that we're increasing taxes, and we are. We're adding $5 million more to our tax burden, and we're raising taxes. As a percentage to the overall property owners, you're correct. It's not as steep as it once was in the past, Mr. Mayor. But what I know as a property owner is I send out messages to my renters, my landlord-tenant relationships, my contracts, and I prime them and say, hey, look, inside my contract clause, and many have this through the Building Owners Association, is that they're allowed to raise rents based on forecast data that's coming up. And so they oftentimes, I get the impression that the industry is watching us. And they also are watching our AWU increases, our solid waste services increases, and our other ones, because they're going to go back to their tenants and their relationships, and they're going to increase rents. And I would bet you that some of them are watching this now going, what are we going to do? So the legislative intent that Mr. Trombley's talking about in April makes sense. But I believe that mortgages, the rating, the mortgagees, the lenders of notes to homes go back into this. And I don't need to see, because we have surplus money that we know of now, I'm not interested in sending a message out to those that say we'll do it later, because I think mortgages will change and rents will change, and that's not a healthful situation. Fiscally, I've looked at it. I think your administration's done a fine job, but beyond the 13%, the 12%, I think we're already there, and I'm going to vote to support this. Thank you.
Mr. Trombley?
I would like to add to what Mr. Starr said, is that, you know, we see staggering statistics such as 44% of the kids in the Anchorage School District qualify for free or reduced lunch. So what we're going to tell people, again, is that we're going to make that more difficult for them, because we're going to raise their property taxes, we're going to raise their rents, we're going to make it more difficult for those kids. And frankly, I think it's sad that we continue to raise taxes, we continue to raise rents, and we make those decisions harder for people. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gray-Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Trombley, thank you for bringing this forward. It's a really nice idea, but I think that it's inappropriate to do this right now. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that if we do approve this amendment, then we're going to have to cut services, because we're in the middle of approving the 2014 budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Starr?
Well, whether it passes or fails, I guess, Ms. Mahoney, you're going to have to get your calculator out, because I can see the upcoming amendments, and we just need to know when we've exceeded our tax cap. If you guys can, we talked about that at the work session, so
we're prepared to do that.
essentially we would have reduced some taxing capacity, perhaps could have been added back in without exceeding the cap. So be sure you raise your hand when amendments may be tendered that exceed the cap. Thank you.
Mayor Sullivan?
Yes, just a final comment. The one thing to keep in mind, too, is that because of the healthy reserves that we've maintained is the reason that Standard & Poor's upgraded us, which does save the taxpayers a significant amount of money. So if you start using fund balance prematurely, and they do analyze that, and you get your bond rating downgraded, you just cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. And keep in mind as well that the reason Fitch did not upgrade us from a AA plus to a AAA is they don't think we have sufficient fund balance. So if we could get Fitch to go along, it improves our bond rating with both agencies, and it literally, with the amount of debt that we issue, it saves the taxpayers much more than what might be contemplated by the amendment by Mr. Trombley.
Have no one else in the queue. Please vote. Mr. Horniman?
No.
Yes.
That motion fails 8-3. We now have before us amendment number 4 by Ms. Dembowski. Ms. Dembowski?
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve amendment number 4. I did. I pushed my button.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this is a $515,000 increase to the Department of Health and Human Services to provide, to sustain the current level of service in the Anchorage Service Patrol. This body recently, let me just say, the funding source, $100,000 of the funding source would come from underspent South Central Foundation grant, and the other $415,000 is from property taxes. This amendment will just maintain the level of service that we recently approved for the Anchorage Service Patrol Center. It's not going to increase it anymore. It's just going to sustain what we just approved recently.
Mr. Starr?
Well, I'm going to speak against approval of this, and I guess the idea that it continues to maintain what we have, the challenge is that it also embeds this permanently funded by property taxes, and I'm not going to beat that one down in terms of how I need to keep that under control and in sight. But two concepts. One of them is the budget year's not over. We just used that argument against this last one, and there may be some surplus now, as you say, in the underspent budgeting, but also the anticipation that we want to raise taxes by $415,000 doesn't do it for me. I'm understanding the vital service, but you know, the idea and the methodology early was to relieve some of the transport requirements of our ambulance fleet. I still don't think that reduces the times that they show up for the call. It may ultimately mean who transports what they find when they dispatch, but the cost is the cost. We've got a fine ambulance fleet, and again, the tendency to raise property taxes kind of goes against our district. Ms. Dombrowski and I can't support it.
Mr. Trainee?
Mr. Dombrowski, did they get the second van on their service they were going to do?
Yes, they did, Mr. Trini.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll join with you on this because we got their commitment to get the van. I appreciate knowing they've got it. Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Steele? I've got you, Mr. Honeman. Mr. Steele?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to comment that this is a measure that hopefully will reduce costs. We don't yet have those figures, as Mr. Starr pointed out, but this is an effort to reduce costs to police and fire.
Ms. Johnston?
This is a question to the administration. We've had the second van in place now for, 3 months? Has the administration found that it has decreased the call-outs for the fire department, and has it decreased cost? And I remember in our past discussions about this, it wasn't just the van, but it was actually the holding facility that had a problem. Is this addressing it?
I'll answer all of those questions. First of all, the increase did not occur until around the 19th of October. And as was indicated, it was going to take them some time to basically get some new people trained up. So they've been on for approximately a month. We are collecting the data, but it's too early right now to have a real good, firm handle on exactly what that all means, but we are collecting the data. In regard to the next question, and that is that in the staffing level that was proposed and agreed to, it really does help the facility itself, because what it does do, it puts more vans on and drivers and personnel, and so when and if the staffing level becomes a problem at the facility, then one of those people can come off the van and sit there until the staffing level is reduced, and you still have adequate pickup out there on the streets. So that was one of the reasons that the modification that we suggested to Ms. Drabowski was that this would be the way to do it. And she did agree, as did a couple of the other assembly members, and it does provide staffing level as well as provides the vans out on the street 24 hours a day.
Thank you.
Mr. Honeman.
Yeah, I'm going to speak in support of this amendment, and I understand Mr. Starr's concern as for raising on the fundamental philosophical belief on the raising of the taxes. We have to pay for what we're doing, and we're paying a police officer, a firefighter, and an apparatus and their staff to go out in lieu of doing a community service patrol or ASP, Anchorage Safety Patrol. It makes financial sense, and it also makes operational sense to not tie up our emergency operations, for something that we know is a concern to our society, but in our communities. But this is the best way to approach it. I support it.
Thank you, Mr. Honeman. Mr. Starr.
Mayor, are you working with the South Central Foundation, I thought, had changed their funding scheme and sort of their support of this overall? Is there anything you can add to the table? And I guess the second question is, why didn't you put it in your budget?
We'd agreed with Ms. Dembowski that she would be the lead on this, and that we are, and as we said when we temporarily funded for the end of this year, that we would be looking for other grant sources, and our folks at Health and Human Services and our legislative package are going to reflect that we're looking for other funding sources as well.
So the S change, that I guess, not to put you on the spot, but I guess Ms. Dembowski is free to move the amendment and raise taxes, but what I want to know is what was your policy towards it? Is that something that the administration is going to be happy to see, or how do you want to?
We support the amendment.
What about the one that I moved later on in the capital plan that talks about some of the state requests for funding to it become more of a state challenge and concern for that? Do you want us to move that one, or should?
Let's wait till we get there, I think.
Well, I guess that's my point, is that I feel that in moving this one, we're going to always embed this into property tax. And I guess my logic in the discussion would be to look at it from the angle of just that. Is this a bigger problem than just property taxpayers should pay for? And again, with the sort of the limited range and the focus of that, I'm not trying to be territorial and community driven in all the topics, but I just don't see that it's a focus argument to make. And do I believe in it? Yeah, I spoke to the work session of it. I just agree that we ought to have the conversation with the state and various entities that could help us in the past. So I'm not going to be supportive.
Ms. Dembowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look at this as a life safety issue. The fundamental role of government is public safety. And what I do know, and what is consistent with the voters of our community, is that they believe that when they call an ambulance, it should be there in a timely fashion. When there is a fire emergency, it should be there in a timely fashion. And my research this summer has indicated there have been multiple times where we've had four-man fire rigs, we've had delays in ambulances, we've had all kinds of delays in fire service because they were on inebriate calls. And I don't take raising taxes lightly, and that's why with Mr. Starr, I co-sponsored the capital amendment to try to get the state to take a little responsibility in this. But I think there cannot be a lapse in service. It's getting cold now. Now is the time when this service cannot lapse. And working with the administration, I'm confident that in the end, property taxes aren't going to be raised. I'm confident that first quarter we'll be able to readdress it. But this is a life safety issue. It is one that our community deserves, because quite frankly, I saw an incident this summer where we had delay in service in Eagle River because we didn't have the support from Anchorage. So I won't sacrifice the jeopardy and safety of our residents for that reason. I think this is a service, just put it in perspective. If you have the service patrol transport somebody, the cost that was given to us at the last this was brought up was around $30. The cost for AFD to transport is over $300. To sit there for an hour with four-man engine crew, it doesn't make economic sense. It makes sense to use the right resource for the right job, and this is a more cost-effective way to deal with this problem, and I urge support. Thank you.
Ms. Jackson, Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't advocate raising property taxes, just like I believe none of us do. Okay, but we have a major public safety issue within our community, and this amendment it really addresses public safety on behalf of our community. When Ms. Dombrowski brought forward an appropriation resolution a few months ago to add a van, I was supportive of that and really appreciate that she took the initiative to bring that forward. And I'm even more so thankful that she remembered that we needed to bring this forward in the 2014 budget, and she brought forward this amendment, and I'm happy about it, and I intend to support it. Thank you, Ms. Dombrowski, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Michaelis, did they still keep their 97 van as a backup in case one of these two go down?
Yes, sir, because part of the deal was they were going to purchase an additional van or vans.
Right, and I was in the
So
meeting.
they have a backup, yes.
I was in the meeting with you and Ms. Dombrowski when we talked to this agency about getting the second van. I appreciate him getting that. We've got so many people out there on the streets now, and as Ms. Dombrowski said, it's down to, 9 degrees now? And it's only getting colder. We've got to get these people off the streets, so I'll be supporting this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Mr. Starr.
Well, this will be my last. I mean, I want to make certain that, the accusation undertone is that I don't support public safety. The budget for fire department's $90 million. That's more than it was last year. So all we can reflect on is that we're continuing to put money in balance into these departments. They're continuing to go up, and I'm very supportive of the fact that we have a solid and robust fire service program, including our EMS. So all things said, it's $90 million this year. That's a lot of money. They ought to have some opportunity in there to do it. $415,000 more on the burden backs of those payers, along with increased ambulance fees. We're starting to hit people pretty hard, folks.
Please vote.
Yes.
Mr. Honeman.
Yes.
That motion carries 10-1. We now have before us amendment number 5. Mr. Trombley.
Move to approve.
Mr. Trombley.
This amendment's for $30,000 and is to provide funding for outside counsel in Eberhard versus the MOA. This went to the Supreme Court, State Supreme Court kicked it back to us. The community, the Turnagain community that this is affecting for those of you who don't remember, this is for the Water Street and Sewer District. And they have hired counsel, and we need to hire counsel to represent us, because when we make a decision on this ruling, this assembly will be acting as a quasi-judicial body, and so we need counsel.
Mr. Starr.
We need counsel.
Ms. Mahoney, is this a liability on the books for this year? Do you know, are you familiar with this?
No, at the end of the year, what we will do is we'll work with the municipal attorney and identify potential legal liabilities and incorporate it in the CAFR. I don't recall if this is on our 2012 CAFR.
Without too much disclosure, Mr. Chairman, have we pulled counsel under contract already for this?
We have not.
We have not. We anticipate January sometime then? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
That's the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
Yes. Please vote. Mr. Honeman.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously. We have before us amendment number 6. Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to approve. Is there a second anywhere? Thank you.
Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a quick reminder for those who aren't able to attend the work session, these are for the Senior Activity Center, Anchorage Senior Activity Center, and the Chugach Eel River Senior Activity Center, both of which have been flat funded by the municipality, operated by nonprofits for the last 4 or 5 years. And so this will give them a small adjustment to account for inflation. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Flynn, at the work session when we dealt with amendments, we didn't get too much into discussion as far as the contract that the groups are currently operating under. When those contracts come up for approval, can the contracts be adjusted to account for this, or why do we have to do this now and not during contract negotiations?
For the Anchorage Senior Activity Center, the contract expires this year, and so if we do not identify the funds available now, and there's an increase in the contract cost, then we're going into fund balance if we approve it first quarter of next year. I'm not sure. I think Chugiak Eagle River is also up, but I wouldn't swear to that. Mr. Vacalis, do you know on the latter?
We're not sure. Back in front of them.
Okay. But the idea here is to give the administration flexibility so that should they come to an accommodation over a contract increase, they have the dollars available to do it.
So, Ms. Mahoney, when you guys put together the operational budget, there was assumed flat funding for the renewal of the existing contract this coming year?
That is correct. And if there would be contract increases that would be known to us, we would incorporate them at the first quarter budget process.
Are we kicking everything to first quarter budget? That was in jest, I'm sorry. That's all.
Please vote.
That's what it exists for.
Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
That motion passes 10-1. We have before us amendment number 7. Mr. Steele, Ms. Dembowski.
Move to approve.
Second.
Mr. Steele.
Yes, this is a placeholder for implementation of the public participation task force recommendation that we improve communications here in the chambers. And so we put the $10,000 in there to provide for funding a COSAC here in the library.
Okay. Mr. Steele, or Mr. Starr?
I guess I read the recommendations as well, and there was a whole host of them in terms of some of that also was comfortable seating and other things that, remodel this podium. What does $10,000 buy in terms of your vision, and how do you know how much it's going to cost?
This is, as I said, a placeholder, and it's for a COSAC out in the lobby where folks coming to the chambers can get additional information or get online information as to where we are and that type of thing. So it's a wood structure probably, and a computer system that's a secure computer system.
Right. And thanks for the answer. Through the chair, Mr. Vacalis probably, or Ms. Mahoney with the IT budget, do we have capacity to expand computers without needing to raise taxes to do it?
Through the chair, if this is the desire of the Assembly, we could probably act on this immediately and do it this year within this year's budget.
I think that's a better answer for me, or maybe one of these monitors, maybe task our IT people to spend the money and get on it. Thank you.
Ms. Gray-Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a comment before Ms. Mahoney made her comment just now, but I'm going to make it anyway. The task force spoke before this body and talked about the recommendations, and they also met with the Rules Committee. Mr. Trainee is the chair, and Ms. Johnson are on that committee. And this was one of the recommendations, and it's a really good one. And thank you, Mr. Steele and Ms. Dembowski, for bringing it forward. If we don't need to make this budget amendment and the administration can put this in place with this year's funds, then I'm very happy about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Dembowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair, Mr. Mayor, would you commit, if we withdraw this motion, to try to find this money in IT's budget to get us a lockdown kiosk out there for public participation?
Yes.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chairman, I wish to withdraw the motion.
Is the second okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, very well. Any other comment, Mr. Mayor? Okay. Thank you. We now have before us amendment number 8. Mr. Birch.
Yes, this basically relates.
I need a motion, Mr. Birch.
Oh, my mistake.
I'll second.
Moved. This basically relates to the omnibus rates and fees package that we have, and it enables the long-standing discussion we've had with permitting up to 5 false alarms per property, and it also includes a mandatory annual reset, which is not included in code.
Mr. Starr.
Mr. Birch and I spoke a little bit today about the concept, and I peeked up on the licensing charge that we already put to the users of alarms, in that one of the concepts is that there isn't a record-keeping system on the number of false alarms if a business changes ownership or a home changes ownership, and you could potentially send a bill to somebody that just bought the house and inherit somebody else's 5 false alarms and get yourself a bill. I guess I'm going to urge prudence on this and not support it out of the respect that we pursue it via the action item in front of us, and then also maybe revisit just the accounting of the fees collected annually for registration and try to get a little sharper on this. I'm not interested in sending police up to that, but there's other workarounds that homeowners and residents should probably be allowed to do first, and I think that's this is a little bit tough on me to say that we haven't tried all those avenues first. So a no vote.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I've got you, Mr. Holman. Ms. Gray-Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear what the police chief has to say about this amendment, because I know that there was some conversation on this subject a few weeks ago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chief Mew?
Chairman Hall, Ms. Gray-Jackson, good evening. From our standpoint, we've worked hard to solve a problem, and that is repeat false alarms. In 2011, when we amended this ordinance the last time, we increased the penalties for having false alarms with the intention of bringing their number of occurrences down. This is a common problem for police departments. Can you hear me? Am I too close or too far from? Okay. We were running about 6,000 unnecessary calls for service per year in 2008, 2009, 2010. Since we passed this ordinance in 2011, the calls have dropped to 4,000 in the first full year, that was 2012, and this year we're on track to come in at 3,200. So in 18 months, we basically dropped them in half, and they're still plummeting. So we think this ordinance is effective. We think it's doing what it's intended to do. There could be some tweaking that the ordinance could use. I know I've heard from citizens that don't know about the registration requirement, and we can do some more things in terms of public education to get people to register. The reason to know of the registration is because many of these alarms are audible. We need to be able to get a hold of somebody who can come out and shut these alarms down. A lot of them don't belong to a monitoring service. They're just an audible alarm. Neighbors are going nuts because these alarms go off all night long, and we need to find somebody who can come out and shut these alarms down. We do not, when alarm changes accounts from one holder to another, we start the clock over again. We give them a month to get their alarm tuned. We allow them the opportunity to not be billed for the first false alarm. That isn't in the code. It's just something we're doing, so that's maybe something that we could tweak. But to let them go to where they don't get billed until the 6th alarm, I ran some numbers, and based on what we're seeing today, only 25 people in the municipality would ever pay a fine. I mean, that would turn we're going farther back into the past than the place where we were when we decided to cry uncle and tighten the ordinance up. So it's not a revenue item. I know this returns some money to us to offset the revenues, but it's really not about revenues. It's about trying to suppress the repeat calls for service. It's a problem all across the country. We've modeled our policies here after Lincoln, Nebraska, which had very good results in suppressing their false alarm calls. I stress that these are calls that are an event that never occurred. This isn't going to real alarms. This is figuring out a way to not have to go to alarms that are nuisance. They are equipment that is not working correctly, or people who are not using their equipment properly.
Thank you for your comments, Chief, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Honeman?
Well, the chief addressed, I didn't realize the chief was there, so he addressed pretty much what we've been discussing openly, if you recall, Mr. Chairman, at the Public Safety Committee there have been some residents that came in with some great ideas and suggestions. The department is willing to look at modification of their database and also the tracking, as well as perhaps suggesting some code change that might make the policy better. And I would caution the body that even though there's fines and fees involved in this, that it shouldn't be one of those things that we're targeting a certain amount of dollars coming in as revenue, because that's not what it's about. The issue really is about making sure that our officers, again, emergency personnel, are not going to the inebriate, that they're not going to a false alarm, that they're going to one where there may actually be a crime occurring and where the emergency really needs to be. So I will not support this.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. And Ms. Johnston.
Chief, you mentioned something that just kind of piqued my interest. So when you did your matrix and you said that only 25 would pay a fine if this went into existence, is there a magic number that people start paying attention to the problem with their alarms?
Well, where it's at before, I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson through the chair. Where it's at before, I think the alarm fee was most recently at $75 per alarm, and there was a grace period. I don't now recall if it was 1, 2, or 3 freebies, but that wasn't suppressing it. So at $75 and with 1 or 2 bites at the apple, that wasn't sufficient to curb the problem, and the problem was growing. I've heard of jurisdictions where it is $700 per alarm. That's how tight things are elsewhere, because it's just it's a huge problem. So we modeled these fees after Lincoln, because we looked at Lincoln's statistics and we saw that they were working. I think there was some tweaking. I think our first proposal got modified just a little bit, but it's very close to Lincoln. And so there's 2 cities for you that are the same size, collect their data the same way with the same system. They're both Tiburon sites, have about the same population, same size of a police force. So they're pretty good comparisons, and I think these numbers show results.
And you say that you do give one pass on the first false one. Is that across the board, or is that sort of a subjective?
No, it's across the board. There are alarms we don't charge for. If it's not the owner's fault, and we can establish that, then they don't get charged for those either. So if we're having a windstorm that night, the alarms go off like crazy. We don't charge for that. We had an earthquake. We have a power outage. You have these kind of things. We don't charge for those. But if we can tell that the paper boy hit the front door with the paper, we won't charge for that. So the officers do an investigation. They go rattle your doors. They make sure everything's okay. They make sure that the alarm is false and never was a burglar there to begin with. And then they try and make an assessment as to whether or not your equipment was faulty or whether or not there was some environmental factor. And if there's something that explains why your alarm went off, then they'll tell the dispatcher, in essence, there's a code for don't bill these people. And so quite a few of them aren't billed anyway. But if it looks like there's nothing wrong, nothing amiss, nothing would explain a false alarm, then they get one of those for free, and then after that, the system starts generating bills.
And would you say that you needed an ordinance to cover that so that it doesn't look like this person's favored over that person?
Well, there's been a false alarm ordinance for as long as I've been around, and probably a lot longer. This has always been codified in ordinance. We're just talking about the particular mechanism that we're using. The other part of it with the permit is what the ordinance allows us to do is if we get someone that's gone so far that billing them just isn't making any progress at all, we can revoke their permit, and then they just can't have an alarm.
Thank you. As somebody that was on the call for friends who, if their alarm went off, and I would get the call at 2 in the morning, and I do know that the APD did come up and they checked everything, and it was a problem with the alarm and wind. I appreciate it, and as much as I understand what Mr. Birch is trying to do, I'm going to have to be a no vote.
I don't want to talk too much on this, but what a lot of departments have done is gone the other way, and they just don't go to false alarms unless the owner or the owner's representative, like a security company, has gone first and verified whether or not it's actually a burglary. that would be something we would have to consider. But that's really an expense for the account owner, because now they've got to hire not only the alarm company and buy the equipment, but they've got to have a security person to respond first. So I think the way to make this an inexpensive ordinance is fix your alarms. Then you don't get the bills.
Thank you. Mr. Birch.
Yeah, Chief, just do you have any sort of a sense for the penetration that exists currently with alarms? I mean, are half of the homes and businesses that are alarmed currently permitted, or are 90% of them, or do you have, I mean, obviously you might not know that exactly, but do you have a sense for how many people are paying the permit fees?
It's picking up, but we got to a slow start. People didn't know that there was a requirement out there. So we started next after several months. Clerk Jones will remember this project. And people got some bills in the mail when they didn't even realize they're supposed to have their alarm registered and all that. So we forgave those bills, and then we created these yellow door hangers. And now every time an officer goes to your place to check on your alarm, he leaves a door hanger on your door. It says, okay, we've been here. Here's the case number. I think we write the case number. Don't quote me, but I think we do. But in any event, it tells you what you're going to get billed for. If you get too many, it tells you how to register and how much it costs. And then one of Ms. Gray Jackson's constituents had some pretty good ideas about doing some proactive stuff, social media wise, and in other ways to let people know they need to start registering.
Okay. And
but right now, the number, it's not good.
Okay. And then just to close, the constituent that had contacted me did not get the waiver, and I think it did follow the property, or I mean, it might have been a prior owner or something. So, if it would be helpful, perhaps we can codify the fact that you're kind of doing it on a case by case basis. Would it be helpful to have that in code, or you just keep doing it on a one-by-one basis?
We're getting better at the implementation piece, and there's probably some housekeeping that could be done. But I would really ask that we keep some significant pressure on so that there's a motivation to keep your equipment in order. Otherwise, it's cheaper just to pay the fines and never fix your equipment.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just that I will not be supporting this. We spent a lot of time in public safety with the chief, and he presented the case for this not passing, so I appreciate. I'll be a no vote on this, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Please vote. Mr. Honeman?
No.
That motion fails 10-1. We now have before us Amendment Number 9. Mr. Flynn?
I'd like to move Amendment Number 9. Get a second, please. Anybody? Bueller, thank you.
Mr. Flynn?
Mr. Chairman, this is the public transportation amendment that would reverse the fare increase, which is why I asked that we take the fees and fines bill up after we wrap up budget amendments. Simply put, we have a subsistence level public transportation service at this point, and I don't think that the service improvements that are contemplated with the fare increase, while welcome, are not sufficient to justify the fare increase. I will note that one change that we're making in the fees and fines bill I think is appropriate, to change monthly passes to 30-day passes. So we'll have to sort of finesse that when we get to that if this passes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Trombley?
Mr. Flynn, it's always bothered me that no past or future current past state legislators ever proposed making funding local public transportation part of the operational budget. That's always really, really bothered me, and it's unfortunate that Alaska is one of the few states that doesn't do that. I do recall, though, at the work session we had in dealing with the fees and fines, we're currently, with the proposed fee increases, will be about 5% above the average, but at the same time, Anchorage is 18 to 20% higher in the cost of doing business. What I am concerned about is that if we don't raise the fees and we kick it back to property taxes, in your opinion, are we simply just delaying the inevitable massive fee increase at some point in time, or do we gradually increase it over time? Because as you can see from the worksheet, taxes currently subsidize public transportation at 58%. With the proposed added service and the fees, we reduce it to 57%. The cost of the department currently is 16% relying on fares. With the fare increases, it goes to 19%. I'm just wondering, do you feel as though we're delaying the inevitable massive hike, or should we do it slowly over time? That's what I'm afraid of with this.
I'm not sure if there's a rhetorical question or a direct one.
Well, no, it's a direct, and I guess I could ask the Director of Public Transportation, Mr. Wilbur, if he wouldn't mind coming forward. I guess it was more rhetorical than Mr. Flynn, sorry. I'll restate my question, is that if we don't raise fees, and we haven't in quite a long time, and we continue to rely more on property taxes to subsidize public transportation, are we eventually going to get to the point where we have to raise fees because we haven't done it in such a long period of time, and then instead of going from $225 to $250, we're going to go from $225 to $450?
Through the chair.
I'm just giving that as an example, the rate increase.
Well, I think the costs are going to continue to go up, like every public service over time. Just the cost of doing business is going to go up. Whether or not the proportion is going to be towards the user or towards the taxpayer is truly a policy call. I think if the rates stay the same, the cost of business is going to go up. So the taxpayer percentage is going to go up. So that's the bottom line.
Or do you foresee into the future, though, that we continue to rely heavily on property taxes?
Yes.
And we will continue to do that. Obviously, it's never going to be 100% pay for service. But what I'm curious about is that if we don't raise fees and we continue to rely heavily on property taxes, is it going to get to the point where we have no choice but to rely heavily on property taxes and to massively increase fees? Do you see that coming in the next 6-10 years, or should we incrementally do it over time? What's your opinion?
My opinion is that we need to implement this. At some point, if this body wants to raise fares, that jump is going to get bigger the longer you wait.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Gray-Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Flynn for bringing this amendment forward, because I thought about bringing it forward myself. And the reason why I didn't is because we heard from the Transit Advisory Commission that supported this, the Mobility Coalition that supported this, and also we got a letter from the Senior Center saying they had no issue with this. But because I'm a big transit advocate, I'm going to be voting yes on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Johnston?
Yes, you might want to stand here. It's maybe a question for you or Mr. Flynn. With your fees increase, one of the things that you had suggested was actually doubling on a couple of your routes, your high. What would you do if we did this? Would you still increase those routes to every half hour?
Can I jump in here for a second, Lance, before you answer? Is that okay, Mr. Johnston? This would replace the amount of the fare increase, if I recall correctly, was basically $300,000 to maintain existing service and $300,000 for additional service, hence the $600,000 in this figure. That's rough numbers. So with that, I think what Lance told us before was they had some ideas, but they hadn't nailed them down. Right. Go ahead, Mr. Wilbur.
Okay. So with the $600,000 increase through the fares, we would use $300 for supporting existing service and $300 to support additional service. The department's recommendation would be to look at the Route 75 because that's one route we have a lot of overcrowding. We have a couple others that we would like to, but we'll only be able to do one.
Okay, thank you. I actually will be a no vote on this because I think Mr. Wilbur did a great job of presenting his fee increase, and I agree with it.
Mr. Starr.
Well, Mr. Wilbur, that is a compliment from me, too, and what I see is always sort of that deep level in the weeds from you, and I think that's carrying a lot of weight for me, that you get in there and you scrub it, and we see a difference, not that last year was more generically across the board, let's just raise fees because it's time. This year I was convinced. Last year we made a big case and we repealed all of the fees and replaced them with property tax relief monies, but this year you did it right. I think you came at us with the focus items. You surgically tweaked your rates in where you thought the burdens would be less impactful, because you do have to raise them, I get that. And then you also scrubbed your fuel budgets. We saw, I dig into there and I see that, the fuel surcharge, because pricing of fuel has come down, you've tweaked money back into the budget. You're running it like you should, and that's a compliment. And so the idea that you've asked for it, I think that's our job, is to support it when you can justify it. And so I'm going to be a no vote on this one, and we'll talk about it again at the omnibus, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Starr.
Mr. Birch.
Yeah, if I remember right, the user contributes, was it about 20% of the operating cost?
That's roughly correct, yes.
Roughly, so
Yeah.
basically $1 out of 5, and yeah, that's what I recalled for the work session, but thank you very much. I will be a no vote on this. I think it's a sufficient subsidy at this point. Thank you.
Mr. Flynn.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just from wrap up, I direct folks' attention to page 3 of 4 on the backup to the S version, noting that public transportation is reducing costs associated with fuel by $135,120 in 2014. So it's not just that costs are going up, it's also that there's more demands for service. And, you know, I represent an interesting district. Half of it never uses the bus. Half of it depends on the bus more than any other part of town. And so I don't do this, you know, to get votes. I do it so people can get to work, and so people can get home, and so they can take care of their kids and support their families. This is important to me, and I appreciate the concerns about subsidies, but I will tell you, I pay a lot more for roads that you people drive on than you do, and I don't drive on as much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Flynn, I appreciate the passionate speech, and I understand I represent a district like that as well. And I'll tell you, my concern is what Mr. Wilbur said, is that if we don't gradually increase fees, at some point in time we're going to find a massive hike, and so we got to find a balance somewhere. So I completely understand what you're saying. Mr. Vikalis, is the city exempt from state fuel tax? Does anybody know that for the fuel that we put in our buses? Is there an exemption on the state level so we don't pay that 8% tax?
I do not know, because we negotiate.
Or 8-cent tax.
We negotiate normally bulk fuel, and I'm not sure how that all works. So I'm not sure.
The only reason I ask is that might provide quite a bit of savings if we could get the state legislature to support that. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. No one else in the queue, please vote. Mr. Harmon?
Yes.
That motion fails 8-3. We now have before us amendment number 10. Ms. Johnston?
Yes, I think we should address this when we're in the enterprise budget.
You want to hold this one?
Yes.
We have before us amendment number 11, submitted by Mr. Steele and Mr. Honeman. Mr. Steele?
Move to approve.
Second.
Mr. Steele?
Yes. I think we all have heard the I guess, pleas from ASD in terms of what the state is doing to their budget. And one of the things that happened is that the state changed the local contribution rate. And so that means that local taxpayers can only provide so much to education. That's one of the components of their struggle. And since we can't provide more in terms of direct funding, direct taxpayer money, what I'm hoping we can do is to be sensitive to those clawbacks, those funds that we charge the school district for various things. And this is a measure to roll that back. Thank you.
Mr. Starr?
Well, this one here is, we've talked about it at length, and I realize Mr. Steele's kind of new to the body, but one of the things that we do when we set the mill rate on behalf of the school district, when we approve their budget in first quarter, we talk about the mill rate collections and how much of our taxes goes to the school district, and we end up writing them a check for that full amount. And I find it, challenging that we wouldn't charge them to collect the fees and dollars across the municipality in terms of the property taxes, as well as pass off the opportunity to pass through their share of the bad debt. And so I guess that, the concept is that the municipality does in fact have the authority to tax and collect, but the burden of that collection should be passed all the way through, much like the cost of credit card managements and all the other expenses that go into running an entity. So we can't go down that road too far where, we start to carry the burden of our education system on our shoulders, and the cost of collecting their taxes is a real part of that. The number, as we talked about the work session, should be corrected by the maker too, just to provide that incentive for clarity. I don't think it's actually 510,000. But irrespective, I'm a no vote. I don't think the school district's clamoring necessarily to say, give us that. I think they get the luxury of a known funding source. We write them a check for exactly what we budget, and that's a benefit in itself.
Mr. Flynn. I've got you, Mr. Harneman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Mr. Starr touched on one of the questions. My recollection from my notes is that the actual amount that we charge the school district is $265,000. Is that correct?
Through the chair, the bill for 2013 is $237,000.
237. Okay. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I move to amend the amendment to change the number to $237,000.
Second.
Any objection?
No objection.
Okay. We've changed that to 230? 237. Thank you. Mr. Horniman.
Yeah, I appreciate the information, Mr. Starr, that presented as far as what we're doing in general government on behalf of the school district. But the simple fact is the school district is not a taxing authority, and they don't have the authority to collect one penny from the community, from its residents, for the school purposes. So it's left to the burden of the municipality. And I find it ironic that realistically we might take it out of the left side of the wallet or the right side of the wallet, but it's still coming out of the same wallet of the individual. So it's really more about shuffling of dollars. And I think Mr. Steele is right on when he's discussing the fact that through the Alaska State Legislature and the Senate, where they kind of hamstring the local community in the sense that if you want the state dollars to the maximum amount, you can only collect a certain amount in local millage, and that's somewhat troubling because then the community itself kind of left holding that as a decision-making process. And so I think that we need to be very careful about what we're billing, because realistically we could go down to the Nats tack on, if we, in the general government, I know we've held meetings in some of the school facilities after hours, and to my knowledge, we don't get charged if we're a government entity. And they could easily charge us back, and so we have to keep track of that, and pretty soon we're not using it. That doesn't do anybody any good in our community. So we're one taxing authority. It's the general government's responsibility. It's been done this way for years. It's only been since this administration that we've been actually charging the school district, to my recollection. And I could be wrong, so forgive me if I am, but I think it's, we're at a point now, particularly with their budget concerns, that we need to be very careful about how much more of a burden we put on the school district's budget when it's not going to do one penny of this is not going to go towards an education process in a classroom. It's all about an administrative function that this municipal general government has done for decades without filling the school district.
Mr. Birch?
I'll be a no vote on this. I think the issue is one of accountability, and this is basically allocating the cost of collections of the very same tax monies that are supporting the school district. Thank you.
Ms. Gray-Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, we need to keep in mind that this policy has not always been in existence. It's a fairly new policy. And Mr. Horniman brought up a really good point. Our community council meetings, at least most of Mr. Trainey's and mine, are held in in elementary schools, and it would be really disastrous if the school district decided, well, we need to make you start paying for this. That would be very troublesome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to reiterate that what Mr. Honeman said. The school district is not a taxing authority. I used to call them a begging organization because they get the funding that they can convince others to give them. They are in the process right now of trying to decide on major cuts. We can't give them more money, but we can help them avoid costs. These are municipal costs to send out the tax bill, not the school district.
Please vote on the amendment. Please vote on the amendment.
Yes.
Everyone wants to get that reset. You're voting the amendment, not the final.
Yes.
Okay.
The amendment?
Yes, we are voting on the amendment, changing the amount to $237,000.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. The amendment carries unanimously. We are now voting on the amended motion. Amendment number 11. Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
That motion fails 6-5. We're now on Amendment 12. Assemblymember Starr.
Move to approve.
Mr. Starr.
Well, this wades into the territory. There's a couple amendments, or maybe one more, that relates to the same funding stream. When we had that change that came out of Juneau, we had some uncertainty as to just what that actually meant, and so we provided sort of a buffer and reserve fund that we held on to, and 2 cycles now have passed, and I think that we anticipated to put into reserve more than we needed. This takes out $800,000 of that balance and reserves it over to property tax relief. That's a known fund, different than that, so I think the idea that we can take this one out, it's already on the books, and it reduces that reserve fund.
Ms. Johnston?
Yes, I'll be a no vote on this because if you look further in your packet, you'll see that this is funding that I would like to use to pay for the summer months of the SROs. And I think that is, for some of the reasons that folks voted for the last amendment, I think that's more important at this point than taking this off for property tax relief. I think that $750,000 to pay for the SROs who at that point are working for the municipality during the summer months is far more important. Thank you.
Mr. Starr?
I guess we could have combined debate. I'm challenged by the next one because I think it's a one-time thing, and that doesn't permanently solve the problem, Ms. Johnson. So the idea that this is a one-time move, once we do that, we won't typically bolster that fund up again for any reason. So I want to remind those that because we're going to move the SROs doesn't provide a permanent funding source. I think these are one-time monies. It reappropriates the books, and quite honestly, they were tax dollars to begin with, and this is really just the final rebate back to the taxpayers from the over-collection that we encountered. So I think that it's 2 topics. One of them is one time. Ms. Johnson has another idea in mind. So, yes.
Ms. Dembowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair, Mr. Starr, just for clarification, this says reduced fund reserve currently being held to offset previous anticipated revenue shortfall. In there, it doesn't say the ASD fund, but I'm assuming that's where this is coming from.
Well, actually, it's not in ASD's money. The fund reserve that I use here isn't to be confused with fund balance. It's an account, and it shows up in the finance department. There's a reserved amount, I should say, not a restricted amount, but an area that we set aside. Yeah.
Reserve amount for ASD.
Yeah. And Ms. Mahoney, what is that number? How much do we have in there?
Through the chair, we currently have budgeted as an operating expense $1.5 million in finance. and it's to adjust for the ASD amount. And so what Mr. Starr's amendment would do is reduce the budget from 1.5 by 800,000. Okay, and so what we had noted, however, earlier is that we anticipated, due to the lower enrollment, that that would leave us with about a 1 to 1.1 fund balance in 101. It would fall in Fund 101. We don't separate it specifically for ASD.
Thank you, Ms. Mahoney.
Yeah, and I don't intend to wipe it out. I think there's still a little bit of cushion in there, but it's this movement that I think reconciles a little bit cleaner based on what happened a couple years ago.
Mr. Birch.
Yeah, I'll be a no vote. It's my understanding that this is contributing to our basically account balance and our good credit rating, and I don't see this as necessary at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Starr.
Ms. Mahoney, is that true on the S version on page 1? I guess it's 1 of 4 on your spreadsheet in the back. Is what Mr. Birch said correct?
To the extent that the 1.5 million this year is not spent, it would just fall to fund balance. Yes, that's correct.
But then you come back trying to bolster that back up. Is that the way I understood it? You want to bring it back up to a reserve?
Well, what we did for the 2014 budget is we recognized that we were $500,000 short in terms of our commitment, our previous commitment to ASD to the 1.5. So we taxed an additional $500,000 to keep it whole. And so what you're doing is saying we don't need to keep them whole. We don't need to keep that much money available because the school district doesn't need it. So for 2013, it will likely fall to fund balance, and for 2014, what I hear you doing is you're just reducing your operating costs to fund it.
Correct. And I guess we've talked about it. Do you concur with that?
It's the will of this body. It's not my decision.
Okay. I mean, I won't press you on the fund balance question as well, but we're about to raise it again at the next amendment. So I think it's a fair use of the money, and I don't find that I want to jeopardize our fund balance either. But again, duly noted that it's a range of fund balance that they recognize between the 12 and the 13% overall. And I just find to have this money tied up, Mr. Birch, the only way we could really use it is if they have a funding shortage at ASD. And I just don't find that that's going to happen in this capacity. The state's funded at a certain level. So the idea that it's sitting there in fund balance doesn't really do anything for the purposes of use. It can only be used for fund balance carryover.
Ms. Johnston?
Yes, I'd like to amend the amendment and amend it to 500,000 as opposed to 800,000. One second.
I'd second that.
Any objection? Please vote on the amendment. On the amendment. The
Yes.
amendment from 8 to 5. Thank you, Mr. Honeman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be in the queue. I didn't...
I've got you, Mr.
Okay.
Starr. That motion carries unanimously. Mr. Starr.
Well, I guess, Ms. Mahoney, I wiped out my calculator. How much have we raised taxes so far tonight?
I think 503. 503,000.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're back to the original motion as amended, and I have no one in the queue. Please vote. Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
That motion carries 8-3. We now have before us amendment number 13. Ms. Johnston.
Yes, as you heard from the previous amendment, this is using 300,000 from that 800,000 to fund, and I understand it's a one-time only, but I also believe policy-wise that with the student resource officers. We do use them during the summer downtown as a municipal for our APD. And I feel that we should be paying for that within the municipality as opposed to charging the school district for those officers during the summer months. And so this year, my approach to financing it was through the fund balance and then $450,000 in property tax. Thank you.
Through the chair, Ms. Johnston, is that a form of a motion? And we
Yes,
need
that is a form. I'm sorry. Yes, I got ahead of myself. Thank you.
And we need a second. Thank you.
Mr. Steele.
I like the way we're going here in terms of trying to adjust those costs. But it is my opinion that these are municipal costs. The school district is not a police department. The school district educates kids. This whole program started as a community policing effort, and it has been increasingly successful. The school district, of course, does not charge the city for the office that the police officers use on the campus. They don't charge them for the electricity that they use. These are police officers that happen to be stationed at that location, and it has been an extremely successful operation. Police department should be funded by the city, not by the students' education.
Mr. Starr?
Ms. Johnston, you were well played there in reducing my earlier amendment for purposes thereof. So your math says how much is left in this sort of the safety net funding thing?
700.
In the fund that we have on the city side still?
Right. And actually, I did spend some time with the school district CFO and discussed this with him, and he feels that they're getting very close. And with the dropping enrollment, he was comfortable with us not fully funding the 1.5.
And I guess the target number I was shooting for was more for like a $300,000 balance carry forward. What were you thinking?
I could have gone there, but I thought, be honest with you, when we had those discussions with the school district, and I had asked the CFO this question, I think we committed to, or we discussed at least a 3-year period, and we're in our second year. And so I felt that I was hitting a happy medium.
Well, it gets into tax, and you've been here long enough to understand tax caps. There is only one, of course. But your taxing source is that. Why wouldn't we put this into the tax bill of the ASD's taxing mill? You want to hit property taxes. I get that concept, but where's the difference I don't get the difference in the $450,000 why you're transferring it to this tax burden of the municipality. Is it principal only?
It is principal. It's policy. What we do, as you're aware of, is that APD bills the school district for the SROs.
Sure.
And during the summer months, they're not in the schools. They are downtown policing on their bikes, the downtown district, which we know in the summer we need, because the summer is a high sun, long day, can be rather extraordinary. And so I feel it's great for the municipality and for APD to have these officers downtown. I'd much rather have them downtown than sitting in a school and really not having anything to do. But because they're downtown and they're policing from municipality, I don't feel we should be putting them within the on the school district side as far as taxing.
I get your message. I'd like a fourth squad car in Eagle River every now and then too, but I guess I'm back to this trend that it's one time and then it also relies on that.
And you're right, and I'm very well aware of that, and this will be a discussion again next year, and I'm aware of that. But at this point, policy-wise, I do believe that they are working for APD, and we shouldn't be charging ASD.
Mr. Birch?
It's my recollection that the school resource officers started out as a grant program that the school district had secured, and that that grant ran out, and the taxpayers are basically, carrying the ball from this point forward. So I guess I kind of struggle with that from the standpoint that it was. Again, and I don't know what sort of trailing obligations there are with that grant. Hopefully none. But I think this is a good middle ground effort. But I am concerned about the fact that we do have apparently a situation that was originally funded with a grant, and then the grant funds disappeared. So.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Honeman, I've got you. Mr. Trombley?
Ms. Johnson, you talked to the CFO, and one of the selling points with ASD, but one of the selling points to push this amendment is you're saying that for the time that they're not in the schools, they're downtown, they're riding their bikes, they're doing that. So the total amount is $1.5 million, correct? The total cost is $1.5 million for the SROs?
I think it's more than, I think it's $3 million.
So this is to cover pay for just the 3 months?
Just when school is not in session.
Okay, and Chief Mew, I have a question for you. And I'll go ahead and talk while you're walking up. One of the ideas initially that I understood community policing to be is that you prevent crime before it happens by having a consistent presence there. Has there ever been any calculation done as far as what the cost of the presence of the SROs? Has there been a financial benefit to the school district? Is there less vandalism, less violence, less issues going on in the schools that have a monetary value associated with it?
We collect statistics, and I can show you productivity statistics of the SROs. I used to track vandalism and theft statistics when I was over at the school district in the early days of the SRO program. I don't think anybody's doing that anymore. But I hate to say this, but when you inject 18 cops into an environment, you're probably going to run up your stats in the beginning because you're getting all this reporting that you didn't used to have. And also, I was over there at the time, and I was really pressing the principals to start tracking vandalism, start tracking theft, so we could get a handle on trends. So I'm going to tell you, probably during this period of time, those crimes probably went up on paper. I don't know that they went up in reality, but I think we spent a lot of time in trying to collect those numbers and track them. So I wish I could show you something in terms of the economics of it. The other part of the SRO program, though, is also interfacing with the kids and trying to develop an other than adversarial relationship with them that translates into a better citizens down the road. And I don't know how you put a dollar amount on that. So,
would you say it's fair to say that to some degree the school district has benefited financially by having the SROs in the school? I mean, while we can't maybe quantify that, would you say that there is a financial benefit to that?
I can't see how it's costing the school district, aside from the salaries. I can't see how the presence there is raising their costs. It's got to be making some impact. I mean, we're dealing with behaviors, and that must be translating into some savings at some place. Whether or not I could track that and prove it, I don't think we've got a number for that.
Okay, thank you, Chief. And the reason I asked that question, Ms. Johnson, is because we're talking about this as if it's a net zero gain, and it's not. The school district is benefiting financially to some degree. They have to be by having the SROs there. And while we can't quantify that, I don't see how having their presence around is simply costing money. And I understand this for the summer months, but I won't support it. Thank you, Chief.
I have a question for Chief Mew, too.
Yes, Chief Mew, you had a comment.
If I could just, there's been some discussion about the history of the program. It started as a Office of Community-Oriented Policing grant, a federal DOJ grant. It was paid for the first year, I think, 75% by the grant, 25% by us, the APD. The next year was 50-50. The third year was 25-75. And then the APD picked up the entire program in year 4. And that was the extent of the program. You couldn't go any longer than that. It just had a 4-year life on it. The APD carried the full cost of the program, of the salaries and so forth, for many years after that. School district picking up offices, computers, some of those kinds of things. And then the funding had shifted to where I think it was maybe a 50-50 split for a little while. Now it's 100% over at the district. So I guess what I'm saying is it's been funded in a variety of different ways over the course of its lifetime.
Mr. Steele.
I have a question for Chief Mew also. Was that applied for by the city or was that applied for by the district, that grant?
No, the APD applied for the grant. But, of course, the district helped in fleshing out that and filling out the application. They had to sign on as a partner, but we were the applying agency,
And
we being the APD.
As I recall, the arguments at the time, we were looking for opportunities for community policing, and this was looked at by the city as a community policing effort. And so Mr. Trombley basically was arguing as though these kids are not Anchorage citizens that we're protecting, that safety is not at the schools, is not a responsibility of all of us, including the municipality. And I just think it's short-sighted to take money from education to pay for the police officers.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know Chief, one time one of the grants we got required us, every year they cut back, like you said, a percentage, also required us never to lay the police officers off due to budget cutbacks. I think it was the original grant we had in Mountain View. So we understood when we accepted the grant, when the feds stopped the money from coming in, we could never lay the officers off. And the same thing I think you'll find with this one. We incurred a cost with every officer that when the feds departed, we can't just lay them off because you ran out of money. Thanks, Chief.
Seeing no one else in the queue, please vote. Mr. Horniman?
Yes.
That motion passes 8-3. We have before us amendment number 14, Mr. Horniman and Mr. Steele. Mr. Steele? We need a motion, Mr. Steele.
Sorry, I move to approve.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Steele?
This amendment is for the municipality to pick up the total cost for the SROs. In my mind, it is a policing effort. Again, ASD is suffering, and the only thing that we can do to help is to offset costs. The fund that we are drawing down, it was set aside for other valid budget increases that the state will allow the district to pick up. It was a fund so that there was money available when that comes up. If we reduce it down for these, what I think are charged back costs that the city is taxing ASD, and it would be a shame to get into a bidding war here in terms of charging the city for things that they use in the schools. The schools are theirs, so, or ours. Anyway, the measure is to pick up the entire cost of SROs.
Mr. Trombley?
Mr. Steele, based on what we just voted on, you might want to do some math and reduce that amount.
I reduced it to the amount such that we do pick up a total amount, whatever that is.
Mr. Chairman.
Should the-
2.25 million.
I've got you, Mr. Horniman. Ms. Gray Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you,
Is that
Mr.
a motion?
Trombley, because I just did the numbers to make sure I was accurate, and I moved to change the amount to $2,250,000 in both areas, and I'd like a second. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to amend the amount to $2,250,000. Anyone to speak on the amendment? Hearing none, please vote on the amendment. Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
Want to
Need a
change?
reconsideration.
Urgent no vote.
Just change your vote.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That motion carries unanimously. Mr. Honeman, I had you in the queue prior to that amendment.
Yes, thank you. I think the chief spoke adequately. I don't need to go back down memory lane, but I can assure you that in my time at work in the Anchorage Police Department, particularly in the day shift patrol command, before the SROs, I can assure you that I would have routinely 22 to 24 officers on shift, and at least half of those officers were, if you will, sucked away to school district calls, problems in the schools. And Mr. Steele aptly pointed out that these students are the children, if you will, residents of the community, and the Anchorage Police Department was picking up the entirety of the cost at that time. This program allowed the department to go down a very valuable, if you'd say, community policing project, but it's not the only time nor the only schools, the only community that does this. And I don't know of any other district where the schools have to pick up the entirety of the cost of its police officers, unless, of course, the police department is answering to and actually hired by the school district itself. There are a few schools around the country that have its own police agency, and those are generally pretty rare these days, but usually they're larger metropolis. So the Anchorage Police Department hires these police officers. They do the training. They actually pull these officers out. Ms. Johnson was partly right. It's not only the summer months that police officers come out of the schools to do things within the community. Almost daily, officers leave the campus environment to help and assist officers on patrol in the areas near their school, on the streets, and car crashes and apprehensions of criminals, not necessarily school students or staff, or even happening on the campus. Not to mention the many, many hours they spend out training, not only the in-service training, but the academies when they have those. So these are police officers hired by the municipality of Anchorage, not the Anchorage School District. And I've long said and long advocated, and I think it's time that we pull the entire cost back to where it was when it first started, and that's the Anchorage Police Department. Thank you.
Mr. Birch?
I'll be a no vote on this based on the prior discussion we had. I think this is a cost attributable fully to the school district, and I think it's an appropriate charge. Thanks.
Mr. Trombley?
Ms. Mahoney, if this passes, how far below the tax cap are we?
We're under the cap by 486.
1,000? Oh.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to check with Mr. Trombley and make sure that Mr. Trombley wanted to change his vote on
the amendment, yes.
On the amendment. He wanted to be a yes vote.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. We have this item before us on the motion as amended. Please vote.
Yes.
Yes, sorry. That motion fails 6-5. We have before us amendment number 15. Ms. Gray Jackson, Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I move this amendment, I'd like to change the amount to $750,000. And with that said, once the amount's changed,
Second.
then I want to move.
Let me make sure we can do that. Can we actually just change the amount and then move it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
750.
Now that the amount's changed to $750,000, I move amendment number 15, which would be 50% of the cost based on an amendment that was approved earlier this evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have no one in the queue. Please vote. Mr. Honeman.
Yes.
That motion carries 7-4. We have before us amendment number 16. Mr. Flynn?
Amendment number 16.
Second.
Mr. Flynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is similar to the amendment on the senior centers. We have two facilities within Parks and Recs which we own but are operated by nonprofits. Again, they have been held more or less flat for the past 5 years, so this is a modest increment for both, one in Northeast Community Center and the others in the Mountain View Boys and Girls Club, to offset some inflationary costs they've incurred over the last few years. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Dembowski?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, Ms. Mahoney, could you tell me how far we are right now under the tax cap?
We're looking at that right now. Hold on.
Thank you.
Yeah, you've committed 1.2 million, so there's 1.9 remaining.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Ms. Johnston?
could I ask Ms. Mahoney, does that include what we just did with the school district fund balance?
Currently, what we have tallied is 500,000 from Mr. Starr's amendment to come out of fund balance, 300,000 from Ms. Johnston's amendment to come from fund balance, so that would be a total of 800,000 in spending that would be funded by fund balance. Additionally, so then the rest would be funded by property taxes. So there's the 750,000 that you just committed, the 450,000. I don't remember where that was. The SROs, and then the others add up. Do you want me to do a line item? Go into it.
No, I would just question.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep my tally here. I was wondering.
Okay. I mean, did I communicate what was intended? Okay.
Okay. We have no one else in the queue. Please vote.
Yes.
That motion carries 6-5. We now have before us amendment number 17. Mr. Flynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the, move amendment number 17.
Second.
You guys are making it hard on me.
Okay.
All right.
Mr. Flynn?
Thank you. This is the $200,000 to increase broadband capacity at the library network throughout Anchorage. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Starr?
Ms. Mahoney, I had asked at the work session sort of a summary on you'd mentioned there's 7 or so different IT systems that go into the broadband calculations here. Are you guys able to answer that? We're doing everything always efficient, and you got a big enough pipe and all that stuff coming in for it.
Through the chair, Lance Ahern, our IT director, and his staff are working with the library to improve the technology and the broadband and looking at partnerships with ACS, GCI, et cetera. And they are working on that now as we speak. We've asked for a plan, if you will, an IT plan, so that we can develop a plan and then implement to the plan. And we're committed to getting everyone here happy with the internet.
Okay, thanks for the answer. I was hoping all that megabytes and megabits transfer rates and all that stuff was going to be available, but it's not that level of detail yet. I think that's part of the plan. So thank you for that answer.
Ms. Johnston?
Yes, I've had the same concerns, and I think this has been a problem for a while. And I would be supporting this amendment, but I would like to do it with a caveat that I would like to have by the 1st of February a plan on how we're going to implement and improve broadband for the library, and I also would like to have a schedule of hardware replacement, so we know that if this is a yearly expense, I want to have a plan to how we're spending it.
Thank you. No one else in the queue, please vote. Pardon. Clerk needs to catch up with me.
Ms. Johnston, is that in the form of a motion to amend this amendment?
I could make that a formal amendment to this motion, that we have by February 1st a plan from IT as far as how they're going to address the broadband and who their private partnerships will be, and from the library and IT on the replacement of their hardware, and as far as their annual replacement.
Okay. We've got a second. Okay, we're going to vote on the amendment to this motion. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Honeman. Who are we missing? Mr. Birch? Mr. Birch is out of the room. The amendment passes 9, 1 no, and 1 absent. We're now voting on the motion as amended. Please vote. Mr. Honeman?
Yes.
Show that motion carries 7, 3 opposed, 1 absent. We now have before us amendment number 18. Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll move amendment number 18.
I'll second.
Thank
For
you very much,
discussion.
Mr. Thomas.
Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One's a little bit different. It's material specific for the library, and the reason I broke the request into two, they asked for 260, is the 200 is most likely to be an ongoing expense. The materials budget we sort of raise and lower depending on how we're doing in a given year, and so this would give them $60,000 for this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Flynn, is this for periodicals, books?
Precisely, yes.
Are they currently lacking in that field? I know we consistently approve contracts with vendors to provide that stuff. Is there a reduction or?
This would keep them at 2013 levels going into 2014.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Starr.
Ms. Mahoney, I looked for this last night and I kind of saw a lot of numbers, but did we actually back out the $60,000 in one-time expenses, or did we carry the continuation budget over on the $60,000? And I guess for those that know what a continuation budget is, I think I couldn't find the reduction on the one-time $60,000. So Mr. Flynn is claiming that we took it out and now it's bringing it back in to keep them current, but I don't remember us backing out the one-time expense of the 60. So did they carry a continuation forward was the question.
Okay, let me make sure I understand. So are you talking about the continuation budget for 2013? For example, we funded the library $200,000 one-time funding in 13, and it was removed?
Yeah, we're on the 60,000 amendment right now. So on page 2 of 4 of your S version, line 78, so your spreadsheet, line 78 has an adjustment.
2 of 4. Oh, the spreadsheet.
I did too. Print them any smaller, it would be. It's a 60.
Okay, so the 63,000 was the efficiency target that we had asked the library to deliver, and so they had suggested a reduction of 63,000, and so by adding the 60,000, you're essentially just restoring it.
It was specific to last year's amendment, which I supported last year, which was increasing this concept of more supplies and that. So you don't track the library budget by supplies. I know you're not the director, but you know, we fund by department, of course.
Sure.
So that, in theory, then the 60,000, as you said, puts back the 63,128. But in theory, we didn't target a funds reduction. This was just your efficiency gain was your answer, I guess. And that's where I think the difference in the nuance is we've asked every department to come back for efficiency gains, correct?
That's correct.
Well, I don't think, in technical speak, Mr. Flynn, I don't think we reduced the supplies budget. I think we asked them to become more efficient, as was the mandate for all of the departments. And so even though it's technical speak, I couldn't find supplies reduction, and I don't think that the library reduced their supplies. Overall library funding, you know, they just got $200,000 for earmarked IT, and I'm just not. Last year I was convinced. I've done library tours. I get it. But I've got other things that the library needs, including structures. So I'm going to be a no vote.
Ms. Gray Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we just ask the library director the question? Because I think that this $60,000 is a legitimate amendment and not based on the reduction that they were asked to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good evening, Assembly members. Last year, we received $200,000, a one-time. That was for 2013. The additional $60,000 would take us back to 2012 rate. It is not an additional $260,000. When we took the 0.8% efficiency, we didn't have any other place to cut. Our supply budgets, everything is already pretty minimal, and we came up with an additional $3,100 for efficiency, and without cutting staff, which we couldn't do, that was the direction, the only place we had left was in materials. Does that answer your question?
I didn't ask the question.
Oh,
but
okay.
I listened to your response intently, mind you, and I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I didn't ask the question, so I was startled for a second there on it. To a degree, it does, I guess, and the efficiency gains were challenges put out as the mayor's request. So the idea that your efficiency gains came in reducing supplies, was that your answer?
I don't quite think of supplies as materials and books as supplies, but if that's your terminology.
Well, we're going to earmark library supplies or library materials in this, and so what we do is that, and that's where my thinking was coming, was that we had funded increased supplies and those kind of things as a set of direct line appropriation for, say, personnel or extended hours. This one does that. So I'm not here to beat it up. We still got 8 hours of work to do tonight, but I want to do it right. And so you know my vested interest in your programs, and I'm doing my homework. I've toured all the facilities, and it's just a hard stretch for me to keep going back to the well of property taxpayers yet. And so I'm going to be no. Thank you, though.
Okay.
Seeing no one else in the queue, please vote. Mr. Harneman?
Yes.
Motion carries 6-5. We now have before us amendment number 19. That's Ms. Jackson, Mr. Trainee, Mr. Steele. I'm assuming that you intend to pull this one. Thank you. We now have before us amendment number 20, submitted by Ms. Gray Jackson, Mr. Steele, Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move amendment number 20, which is adding to the Health and Human Services Department $129,721 to provide for a homeless coordinator. And if I can speak to that briefly, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I continue to applaud the mayor. When he first took office, he made the homeless situation in our community a priority. And he took it a step further by hiring a homeless coordinator coordinator, which really turned out to be a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, but fortunately for the Assembly, that coordinator became the Assembly's ombudsman in 2012, and so that homeless coordinator position has been vacant since 2012. It's a much-needed position, and I'd like to see this body approve this amendment so that we can have that person in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Trombley.
Mr. Mayor, when we had the work session on the budget amendments, one of the things that you did mention, and it really wasn't time for debate, so we didn't get too much into it, but I'd like you to clarify right now, one of the things you said the homeless coordinator did when he was there was he set up the programs which are now being currently run by the Department of Health and Human Services. In your opinion, what would a homeless coordinator do now that those programs are set up and they're currently being run? Would they add additional programs? Would they take over operation of those programs?
The functions that Mr. Hess was responsible for initiating, along with many, many community partners, are being now handled by primarily Brittany Matero in the Department of Health and Human Services. So she's assumed the role of homeless coordinator along with other duties that she performs as well. And so her and other department members do manage the programs that we've established, whether it's the cold weather plan or certainly helping us direct grants to the right agencies like we did with Clare House so they could buy the Eagle's Nest Motel and double their capacity. So the programs are being operated, and I think we're doing a good job of it, so we don't support adding this position at this time.
Did that individual, did she get a raise for taking on the additional responsibility? Has she received additional compensation for that?
I believe she has, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Birch?
My question's been answered. I had the same observation from our work session that this effort has been embraced and encouraged and supported within the administrative budget already. Thank you. And again, no vote.
Mr. Trainee.
I think if you go outside and look around Anchorage, the amount of homeless we have in Anchorage indicates this position needs to be filled. And a question for Lucinda, ma'am, Ms. Mahoney. Where are we at now in the amount of money we've spent tonight, and how much do we still have left before we get up to tax cap?
We've spent 1.5 million, and we have 1.6 million remaining.
Okay.
Mr. Starr.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Trainee, I appreciate your observations thereof. I think that I commend, sort of the mayor and the homelessness task force that came together with a plan and that implementation of that plan. What I sense is that the homelessness coordinator position may not be the right answer to the increased challenges. And so I think you and I don't want to go on record. I'll go as a no vote on this. That means that I don't want to respect the problem that's continuing to plague our community by my no vote. I think that the strategic plan works. The faith-based communities are kicking into gear in a coordinated effort. And so it's time to move on to additional solutions and programs that would be that. I don't find it vital that a coordinator come into play strictly to adhere to a plan. It's actually working very well. And so I commend the mayor for that initiative to pull it forward and then realize when it doesn't need to be supported for operations. It's running. Thank you.
Mr. Trainee.
Mr. Starr, I don't assume because you're going to vote negative to this that you care any less about the homeless than I do, sir. Don't ever read into what I'm saying by that, but when I take a look at what this individual did, I think she was also working on putting that new complex by the airport. I think most of her time was spent doing that, not homeless coordinator.
Mr. Flynn.
To hire this position.
Mr. Flynn.
Well, this is a tough one, Mr. Chairman, because obviously, I think most of you know, homelessness has probably the highest impact on my district for the entire city. That said, I do tend to concur that if we're going to allocate more dollars to addressing the issue, I'd rather see them go into direct expenditures for facilities, for, as Ms. Dombowski put forth, the additional service patrol coverage and so on and so forth, rather than another body, or a capital expense to, provide more facilities than we have, because we're struggling right now. So I'm going to reluctantly vote against this just because I don't think it's the highest and best use of the dollars, though I do appreciate the sentiment behind it.
Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may ask the mayor a question. Mr. Mayor, you said that Ms. Material got an increase. How much was that increase?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah, was it 3% like the other executives?
This was because her job description changed. She actually, what was the title, George? She was promoted to division manager, so there was a raise associated with that, not the normal cost of living increase.
Okay, so if I can continue, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Mayor, she's division manager, and her title is also / homeless coordinator?
That interacting with all the different agencies that we were partnered with is one of her jobs, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
There's no one else in the queue. Please vote. Mr. Honeman.
Yes.
Who are you with? That motion fails 7-4. We now have before us our final amendment, number 21. Mr. Trombley.
Move to approve.
Mr. Trombley.
These are for positions. One is for an additional administrative position in the municipal clerk's office, and the other is a full-time employee for code enforcement officer for Title X, and this would go to the community development department, but their responsibility, the code enforcement, is for actually enforcing Title X, which is the assembly. So it would benefit the assembly as far as enhancement for code enforcement for a business license, but it would be housed in community development.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee.
Just, Mr. Chairman, I spend a lot of time with our clerks, and they're working in their cells to death. We can't keep adding responsibilities to our assembly office, the clerk's department, without adding them to staff to get this job done. So I'll be supporting this, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dembowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question. How many FTEs do we currently have doing code enforcement for Title X?
None.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just a question. Is there any anticipated revenue associated with this? I mean, additional licenses that actually get registered or enforcement against those who fail to?
There would be some, Mr. Flynn, yes.
Not yet quantified?
The clerk is looking into that. We don't really have a number for it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Trombley?
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Ms. Johnston?
Yes, is the .4 for the Assembly Council office, is that in addition to her, I think she has a half-time employee now?
Yes, it is. It would be an 8-hour-a-week individual that Ms. Tucker believes that she needs to be able to keep up.
And I do remember that she used to have a full-time person. Is it a paralegal position? Is it a administrative position? What is it?
Paralegal.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Starr?
Mr. Vacalis, you may understand this. Is Chapter 10, or excuse me, Title 10 not being enforced because we don't have enough personnel, or because there's a lack of knowledge on the code language and the enforcement requirements? When we fund this position, why aren't we doing some of those tasks now?
My understanding is that for a number of years now, the municipal clerk's office has been responsible for enforcing that particular title, at least that portion of the title dealing with business licenses. So that's my understanding, and what I understand now is that what we're saying is we need to go ahead and have a code enforcement officer designated, a new position, and that would go to community planning and development. I assume that's what the intent is.
I get all of that, this idea that we somehow have to anchor it over there, and I know that the community development has the code enforcement requirements and in theory the code experts, but being resident in the clerk's office, I mean, it's similar to the half-time code enforcement that we see out in Chugach Eagle River, I would think, because we just have one dedicated. So what's the rationale then if the clerk's office really wants somebody they can grab a hold of to respond timely? Why wouldn't we just anchor that position in the clerk's area over here at City Hall?
You know, you're asking the wrong person. We did not initiate this, so if this is something that I guess helps the clerk's office, if they're overwhelmed right now, then I guess that's it. But the bottom line is the administration did not request this.
I get it. I thought you could answer the question on the procedural side of comment, but I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Back then to Mr. Chairman, the answer is the same. Why wouldn't we just anchor our own code enforcement person that the clerk's office could have ready, available to consult or take calls, or all the other pragmatics that go into Title 10?
Mr. Weaver?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Starr, basically in code enforcement today we have 6 sworn officers. They're pretty much uniform in their abilities to carry out and enforce code and title. They historically, in the few past years, there were 8 enforcement officers, and subsequently 1 reduced in 10 and 11, so we're down to 6. This enforcement officer would take those responsibilities of enforcement of 10, plus we would use the other officers as well. They'd all be pretty much cross-trained in dealing with all the code, and they would do the health code, planning code, and Title 10. And for consistency purposes, because some of those cases go to hearings officers and, on to court occasionally, that they're skilled, and that's really the right group to do it.
I appreciate that. I'm just looking to process it. I kind of heard about the amendment sort of late in the game here, but through the chair, Ms. Mahoney, the mechanism that the Assembly budget would go up and the staff would go over there, why couldn't we cover that under sort of an IGC type of arrangement as well? Is this the right way to fund this budget matter-wise? Specifically the code enforcement person, even though what Mr. Weaver just told me is that it's going to be a blended service. We're not going to get the full 100% of the cost. So
Through the chair.
can't we just cover it through an IGC?
It's possible, but my suggestion would be that you would have economy of scale in the community development department. You will have supervisors there who understand compliance and how to manage this process. So my opinion, just hearing the conversation, is that it would be better if it would be just directly charged to community development.
Directly charged to community development?
Right, in Fund 101, budgeted and charged in regard to their payroll.
Unfortunately, I left that one at home. It didn't stay stapled. What are we saying we're going to do, Mr. Chairman? We're taxing the Assembly budget on the entire amount?
Okay. Mr. Starr,
not taxing, that's the wrong word. I guess we are raising taxes to do it, but are we putting the burden into the Assembly budget?
Yes, we are. The clerk would like to respond.
Through the chair, Mr. Starr, I agree with the things that Ms. Mahoney and Mr. Weaver have said. One of the things that the chair and I discussed, and that I would like input from the entire Assembly, we'd like to develop an annual work plan. And the work plan that will go to community development will include that the code enforcement officer would work on towing. Perhaps they would work on massage practitioners, adult-oriented business establishments, and we would have a plan that we would give to them, and then we would expect a report back on what that code enforcement officer has done for what we need them to do under Title 10.
I get all of that, and so I kind of felt initially that it was to sort of get our own guy, somebody we could grab a hold of. And when I hear Mr. Weaver saying that it'll sort of be a blended affair, which is appropriate to increase the code enforcement, but the outcome, is more important to me. That if you're finding that you don't have anybody to reach out to that's experienced, qualified, and whatever, I'm not certain that just by saying it at the microphone we're going to get it. That's why I was saying, hey, resident one right here, if we're going to budget it or pay for it. Right. I'd really suggest that you think about allocating, or changing the amendment. I can't support it as an increase to the Assembly budget from that permanence. In spirit, I agree with it, but we typically IGC back and forth between areas of responsibility, and we hold accountable. The work plan, great idea. The other thing I asked for when my immediate response was sort of in moving on to the next request for other labors internally to the clerk's office to talk to the whole amendment was that what I wanted to see perhaps was a job description / accountability of function per workspace. I see a lot of good faces that are working hard up in the clerk's office, but I'm not sure that we know exactly what level their assigned duties are, cross-trained, without rambling here, beating the topic to death. I'm not going to want to send a message that I'm not supportive, but I think it's a little bit premature yet.
Right. Mr. Starr, the reason we met with Mr. Wheeler to have the discussion about specifically what you're talking about, he has sworn officers that have supervisors that know how to make sure that they do their job right. And what will happen is they will be responding directly to the clerk and her requests. So we are going to have a person we can reach out and grab for specific issues as they arise before us. They're just going to be housed over there because the clerk really didn't want to bring enforcement into her office. She doesn't have the training to oversee them.
Well, and it is debate. I just don't find that it's necessary to tag our budget for that entire amount. Whether it comes back as an IGC later on, it might. But again, the department function, as you just said, is just that, and so that's all of it. And I'm not wanting to be set up that we'll get IGC'd anyhow for all the oversight and the supervision and the overhead of that department back through, and it just seems to be, based on what the CFO said, it's cleaner if we try to rework the amendment, and that's my advice. I just think that it's by department. They do the function, and by department it'd be better to appropriate the money over there as opposed to growing the assembly budget. So,
okay. Madam Clerk, you had one more comment.
Yes, Mr. Starr, perhaps the amendment isn't clear, but we did intend for the code enforcement officer to be housed in community development. I don't know if we can do this, but I don't expect that this would raise the assembly budget. It probably should say department assembly / community development.
Mr. Trainee?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this discussion we've had. But with what we're doing for the clerk's office, for example, all the work they've helped us with this new towing ordinance, you asked us to take that project on. We need somebody to deal with the licensing. And if we don't have it right now, you're going to work them where they can't become efficient in getting this done. And let me tell you, Julia does a heck of a job for this body. We have legislation being adopted all the time, drafted by her. She needs a paralegal to get this done successfully. So I'm definitely going to be supporting this, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Birch?
I guess I am not entirely convinced that we need to add this additional money to the assembly budget. I think from a legal standpoint, we have basically the shared offices of the city attorney as well as the assembly council, and I think we've also discovered that we can have some coordinated work with community planning. So I'll be a no vote. Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler? How did you get in the queue? Welcome, Mr. Wheeler. Ms. Johnston.
I have a question for the clerk as far as the code enforcement. Currently, we have code enforcement issues with massage parlors and maybe adult entertainment under Title 10, and you're looking at doing something with towing, but we haven't finished that yet. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Ms. Johnston, we're looking at the towing ordinance exists right now. And for example, a tow operator has to have a license and each tow truck has to have a sticker in their vehicle. There's no one that is going out right now to check to make sure that tow operators have a license or that they have a current sticker in their tow truck. And that is not happening. So that's why Mr. Flynn's prior comment is probably correct. If we did have a code enforcement officer from community development working 2 to 1 to 2 weeks per month working through the plan, like towing, they'd be able to go out, check all the tow people that are licensed with us, find out who doesn't have their stickers or their licenses, then they'd come in and have to get them. They'd get a violation or a notice of violation, and hopefully we'd get some increased revenue because they'd be getting licensed.
So are you looking at, if this passes, you're looking at implementing this as of January 1st?
I would be happy to implement it whenever it gets passed.
But in other words, you've got a lot of duties in place right now that you're looking for code enforcement for that you haven't been able to enforce.
Right, Ms. Johnston, through the chair, code enforcement has some of these responsibilities already, and we call them when we need them to go out and enforce something, when we have an issue. But what we'd like to do is do it consistently and have a plan so that it increases compliance with the license requirements that we already have. Another issue that came up recently was roving vendors. And there's another code that we don't know if it's being enforced as it exists. And we need some, for example, a code enforcement officer could go out and check the roving vendors or the ice cream vendors. So that's the idea of the code enforcement officer. It's to enforce the code as it exists. The delay would happen, it would take as long as it would take code enforcement to hire someone for the position.
And my final question is on the 1.4 FTEs as far as the clerks. And could you provide a breakdown of how that would be?
My pleasure. Through the chair. The clerk's office is looking for a 1.0 admin position. And the purpose of that position is primarily to provide backup, and it is for the agenda coordinator position. I might do a little bit of rearranging in the office, but what it would do, it would rearrange duties so that we have a backup to our agenda coordinator. As many of you know, we are vulnerable right now because we don't have anyone that knows how to prepare the agendas, input the documents for the agendas, and it greatly concerns me. I have been in this position for almost a year and a half. I have done many of the things that Mr. Starr has asked, evaluated duties, evaluated positions, and I am convinced that we need another body so that we can make sure that we have coverage for some of these critical areas.
And the cost of that body?
The cost, we've put in the cost for 1.4 FTEs, and that's the $111,000. I think we're looking at a relatively entry-level position.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Trini, you wanted to expand on the towing?
Mr. Chairman, the towing issue, when we have people towed, the tow truck operator is supposed to have a sheet of paper in his car that gives him permission to tow that vehicle from that specific spot. In fact, Daryl Hess went out there, and a gentleman's being towed, and Daryl asked the tow truck operator to produce proof he could tow that vehicle. He said, "No one's ever asked me for that," so he had to drop a vehicle and not tow it. That's what this code enforcement officer will do, is check to make sure that if a vehicle's being towed, that each vehicle has a signed sheet giving them authorization to tow that vehicle off that property. And these vehicles that are being towed are your constituents. This helps your constituents out by making sure we don't have illegal towings going on. Because believe me, when we get that towing ordinance, this space will be full from people that are illegally being towed in Anchorage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to move to amend this amendment, and I'd like it to read that $102,248 be an increase in the Community Development Department, and at the same time, for the purpose of what it states right here, Code Enforcement Officer for Title X Business Licensing, but that the administration, along with this amendment, recalculate the IGCs from the Community Development Department to the clerk's office to cover the services that this position will be providing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I've seconded all of that.
Okay, that's before us for discussion. Did you want to discuss that, Mr. Starr?
I do, and Mr. Weaver is actually the strong point in this discussion for me because I rely on code enforcement quite a bit, both in my district and elsewhere. So, Mr. Trainee, I respect all that. Lightly, we just kind of park where we want out in Eagle River, and we don't tow. But
You're still part of the city, sir.
I get it. Mr. Weaver, the mandate to sort of work the plan, a working plan or some way to attend to details as it relates to Title 10 and all of that, I know you'll do it. And so the idea that, expanded code enforcement that can be useful throughout the municipality as needed. And if it's a full-time job over here, I guess it is. You'll have to see that in the work plan, but you'll take an initiative to work with our clerk on the plan and the supervision and the style of enforcement, I guess, is important, as well as how we enforce code, to me is helpful, and you do a fine job of that. So I'll rely on that. I appreciate Ms. Gray Jackson moving the numbers in the right categories, and I'll support both. So thank you.
Mr. Trainee?
Madam Clerk, do you have a problem with this amendment?
No, sir, no problem at all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Please vote on the amendment. That motion carries unanimously. We're now back to the motion as amended. I see no one in the queue. Please vote.
You let the minutes reflect that Mr. Honeman joined us, sir.
Welcome, Mr. Honeman.
Thank you. I've been on the phone the entire time. Thankful for my grateful employer.
Mr. Trombley? Thank you. That motion carries unanimously. This concludes our action on item 4B. I'm looking at the clock, fellow assembly members, and the chair. If it's your desire, I don't think it would be inappropriate to take.
Shouldn't we vote on the budget first?
Just 1 minute to, yeah.
So that's my question. Do you want to vote now on this and have a motion to reconsider? I think you should, don't you?
We could. Okay. The item before us, prior to my finishing my statement, is voting on 4B as amended. Seeing no one in the queue, please vote.
The operating budget.
The operating budget. Yes.
As amended.
Please vote.
Reconsideration.
That motion carries unanimously. Mr. Trainee.
Second.
We've got a motion to move for immediate reconsideration, urging a no vote. There is a second. Please vote. Mr. Steele, you want to reconsider your vote? That motion fails unanimously. Okay, now I'm back to my topic. If the Assembly would like to take a short 15-minute break, we will adjourn this meeting. The rest of the items on this agenda will just continue under our old business items on the new agenda that we're going to go into. Motion to adjourn? Second? We stand adjourned.